but by June of 1941, Germany was at war with the Soviet Union, and the Pope did not want to weaken that war effort. Also, the Pope felt that confrontation with Nazi Germany and fascist Italy would endanger the Vatican's ability to function. Remember that the Vatican is an independent country totally surrounded by fascist Italy, and it was totally dependent on fascist Italy for its ability to communicate with the world. The Vatican would not have been able to send messages by diplomatic pouch through its diplomatic representatives to Europe, war-torn Europe, much less the rest of the world. They were dependent upon fascist Italy for electricity and water and communications and food supply. And in the eyes of Pius XII, the most important thing for fulfilling what he regarded as his responsibility to the institution of the Roman Catholic Church. He also felt, once after the Germans had occupied Italy in September of 1943, because until then Italy was a partner on the side of the Germans, there were no yet deportations of Jews from Italy during the time that Italy was an independent partner of Germany, although the Jews were persecuted. But he, after September 1943, when the Germans occupied Italy, when the Italians tried to get out of the war and the Germans occupied, then it was the Germans who were surrounding the Vatican City. Then it was the Germans upon whom the Vatican was dependent, not only for physical existence, but for to fulfill its spiritual mission. These were some of the factors which influenced Pius XII in this decision about what he should do or say. I am not justifying them. I am not accepting them. Many of us feel that this was a very sad, to put it mildly, a very sad thing that Pius XII did not speak out more strongly. But those were his reasons, and we can discuss them if you wish. I would just add to that these messages, this encyclical, this Christmas message, those who wanted, and men and women of the church who wanted to be responsible and help the Jews, heard these messages. And when asked during, but particularly after the war, why they had done what they did to help the Jews, some of them said, we felt we were doing what the Pope would have wanted. We felt that we were fulfilling our responsibility as Catholics. Now, I'm going to get into much more Catholic rescue work and what actually was done to help the Jews. But those who were favorably disposed toward the Jews in the beginning went on to feel that the Pope was on their side, if you will. The problem was that those that didn't want to hear the message didn't hear it. So that Catholics in many all European countries occupied by the Germans, who were hostile to the Jews, continued to be as hostile as ever. And so there was no teaching, there was no religious guidance, there was no example, no urging to show courage and faith and human decency to a particular specific group of people. So that's the question of the papal silence in very general terms. A complicated, regretful decision or policy. Pius XII was in many ways a very, not timid man, but he was a very cautious man. He was very prudent. He didn't take risks. He was not a man to encourage or urge or engage in confrontation. His personality came out in this decision, I think. There were definitely people on his staff or working with him and for him who were urging him to be conservative, to be cautious, not to take on Hitler, not to endanger the church as an institution, who were urging him toward silence. There were certainly some who were begging him to make a statement. We know perfectly well that he was getting messages from men, leaders of the church, bishops in Germany, in France, in Holland. There are many stories. Why don't you say something? Do something. Support us. Help us. Back us up. We've got to show guidance. The world is asking where you are. as a religious leader? Where are you? And the response was what I've described. So it was a very difficult time, to put it mildly, and I've tried to explain a bit the reasons. I sometimes get this out better in a quick question and answer kind of interchange with students. We talk about it. You can think about it a lot, and recognize him for what he was, a conservative man. Was he an anti-Semite? There is not very much in the historical record about Pius XII to suggest that he was an anti-Semite. There's not much in the record to suggest that he was specifically anti-Jewish, although there were some comments made by him, particularly in his younger days before he became Pope. He nevertheless did reflect the certain biases of the men of his class and education and religious background. And by that I mean that although it did not filter down to the lower levels of men and women of the church necessarily, there was a great deal of anti-Judaism at the top levels of the Catholic Church. There are many, many reasons for this, and this is a whole other lecture about modernism, about the threat to the Catholic Church, about what the modern world meant to the Catholic Church, not Jews necessarily, but the threat of modernism. Remember that the unification of Italy had taken away from the Catholic Church the whole Papal States area in central Italy that had belonged initially to the Vatican. The popes and their prelates close to them saw the modern world as a threat. The French Revolution had, among other things, emancipated the Jews. The Jews were seen as the beneficiaries of revolution, as the advocates of many of the values that we hold today. Liberalism, democracy, human rights, all these good things that the church saw as a threat, because those good things of the modern world threatened the monopoly that the church had had on education and the lives of Catholics throughout Europe. And it wasn't only those good things. There was also the danger of socialism, the danger of Marxism, the danger of revolution in general, which the church saw as a threat to their existence, and with which they linked the Jews. The Jews were, in fact, in the eyes of these Catholic leaders, a kind of scapegoat for a whole world that they did not like, and for a whole world that they felt threatening. This, of course, should not have been the perception, and it, of course, changed with time, but slowly, so that some of these attitudes, these fears of modernism, and by extension, the Jewish people, lasted right through the war years and into the post-war, post-World War II years. This anti-Judaic threat, fear, bias. I should add also, just to complicate the brew a bit, that the church, for the most part, was not a strongly racist institution. Now, we can all find indications of racism among within the Catholic Church, but not a lot. Remember that the church, leaders of the church believed that all Catholics, once Catholics, were equal. That's at least what they were supposed to believe, and most did. That racism was an evil, because if you were a Catholic, you were equal in the eyes of God to all other Catholics. So that the church leaders, by condemning racism, were not necessarily condemning anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism, because they saw this, not always, but often saw this as two different things. So Pius XII reflected all of those biases and prejudices, and if I've simplified too much, and sometimes if I've overstated in my anxiety to get it across to you, then please ask me questions again after my remarks, but that's what I'm trying to convey to you. That's where he was coming from. That's where Pius XII was coming from when he was making these decisions about what to do. Now, I can touch very briefly on what he knew. He certainly knew that Jews were being murdered in enormous numbers. We have no doubt about that. He did not necessarily understand exactly what Auschwitz was, but he certainly knew about Treblinka, about Majdanek, about the killing fields in the Soviet Union. He knew. I sometimes ask myself whether he really understood. I'm not trying to make excuses for him, but it does seem to me impossible that a man who really understood that women and children and old people, the enormity of this horror, could have acted as he did. But he certainly knew about it. Is there a difference? Does knowing mean understanding? Does understanding mean visualizing? These are questions I will pass along to you, because these are questions I cannot answer. So what else could the Pope have done? The Pope could have spoken out against internment camps. Now, I'm not talking about the German camps, the death camps or the concentration camps, but I'm talking about various internment camps that existed in both France and Italy, Catholic countries. Could he have done more to help the fate of Jews in those camps? This again is a long story. He did send diplomatic representatives to the biggest camp in Italy, Faramonte, Cassia. A representative of the Vatican did go. And this is often cited by the apologists for Pius XII. Yes, he did care. Yes, he did send a delegate to Faramonte and to some of the other internment camps for foreign Jews in Italy. And yes, he did. But primarily, these were missions either to provide financial aid, physical aid of some kind to prisoners in these camps who were Jews but who had converted to Catholicism. That was the initial impetus for these, not rescue missions, for these assistance missions. And we have to remember that when we read about aid that did go to, the little bit of aid, not a lot, that did go to the internees in these camps. And the other dimension of this was the hope to convert. And the whole question of conversion is a complicated part of the story, which we can talk about later with the questions. This I'm going to have to pass over very quickly, but this is a question of what could the Pope have done to intervene in some of the countries where Jews were being persecuted. What could he have done behind the scenes? Now, I've talked about the public position, the reticence of Pius XII not speaking out publicly. Could he have acted behind the scenes diplomatically? Remember that the Vatican, the Holy See, is an independent nation. It had ambassadors to all of these countries. The ambassadors were prelates, monsignors, and they were ambassadors to Germany, to France. They were called nuncios, papal nuncios. They were just called papal delegates. But I have this map only to show you, and this is not a very good map, but that Italy had occupied territories, both in Greece, which you can see on this map, but also all the way down the Dalmatian coast, and also in southeastern France, the part of France that bordered along Italy. Could the Pope have intervened through his diplomats to get better terms for the Jews? The answer to this is so immensely complicated that it takes several classes in a Holocaust course. But there were some interventions. The Pope, particularly in Dalmatia, in this part of the coast along the Adriatic, which is not in white on my map, but which was Italian occupied, there were some papal interventions with occupying forces, with Italian diplomats and military officials on the scene, asking them to resist German demands for Jewish deportations in the Italian-occupied areas. There were some interventions. They tended to be extremely polite, very non-threatening, and they were also given to Italian diplomats and military personnel who wanted to hear that already, and in most cases had already decided to resist the German demands for a deportation. So there were some diplomatic measures taken, but again, it was few and far between, polite, diplomatic in every sense of the word. We now get to the question of actual rescue operations. This is a picture of a French Capuchin priest, Père Marie Benoit, the man I have just written about, a biography. That's my most recent book. He was French. He rescued Jews in Marseille and then later in Rome. I looked greatly and carefully and in much detail about his work for many reasons. I was fascinated by it because he had done his rescue work in coordination with Jewish pals. It's a wonderful story of Jewish-Catholic friendship. After the war, he continued very strongly to urge Jewish-Catholic reconciliation and the continuation of friendship in ways that led eventually to Vatican II and Nostra Aetate. But during the war itself, he was an adventurer, and this was an adventure for him. And his Jewish buddies were young men in his, about his age, and very lively people with whom you fall in love when you read their stories. Most of them were refugees who had lost family members or who had made a great trek from Eastern Europe to Italy by way of Germany and France. They were bright people, adventurous, daring, imaginative, and through them, Père Marie Benoit was able to work to save Jews. He became a kind of a leader in Rome of this Jewish Catholic rescue network because he was a priest, so that he could place Jews in monasteries and convents where he knew someone, and that is how it worked. I am telling you this because I am going to be addressing the question of how involved was Pius XII in these rescue operations. When you look online, when you look at the strong statements that are favorable to Pius XII, you will read that Pius XII saved thousands of Jews, that he gave orders to convents and monasteries that they opened their doors to Jews. That was the question I was exploring in my book about the Vatican, and that is one of the reasons why I looked so carefully into this man, because he was probably the leader of rescue, at least in Rome. And if the Pope was going to be involved in rescue anywhere, it was going to be Rome, obviously. I found nothing in the story of Père Marie Benoit which would indicate any kind of a role for Pius XII. There were no orders given to Père Marie Benoit to act the way he did. There was no money from the Vatican given to Père Marie Benoit to conduct Jewish rescue. And believe me, it cost money, because the Jews who were hidden in monasteries and convents had to be supported. They couldn't just go. Remember that maybe the Vatican had wealth, maybe it didn't have wealth, but these monasteries and convents out in the boondocks, and even in Rome, did not have large resources. And I'm not saying that they turned Jews away from a convent or a monastery because those Jews couldn't pay, although that did happen. But they did accept Jews, women in convents, children in convents, men in monasteries. They did accept them with the understanding that those Jews would be supported financially, that they would get ration books, because you couldn't buy food without ration books, that they would be given a minimum of clothing, blankets, and support, and that they would be helped psychologically. Remember the visits that Père Marie Benoit and his associates, and now I'm talking more about his Catholic associates, they would visit the monasteries and convents and reassure the people who were hiding there that they had not been forgotten, that their children were okay in a convent somewhere else, that they had to continue to fight for survival and to live. And that was the kind of thing Père Marie Benoit did, but that required some resources. So there's no indication that I've ever found that the Vatican provided any kind of financial support, and I have even found some evidence of disapproval. Did the Pope know that Jews were being hidden in convents and monasteries in Rome? Yes, for the most part he did. It is my very clear impression that he did not know the extent of it, and he didn't want to know. I think what happened on the part of other prelates of the Catholic Church, including Père Marie Benoit, is that individuals, Père Marie Benoit was not a Roman native, but let's say prelates who worked at the Vatican. Rome was a city with great pre-war friendships, if not family ties, between Catholics and Jews. A Catholic prelate at a high level in the Vatican would have known a Jewish family, most likely. They would have grown up side by side in the city of Rome. There would have been an intermarriage somewhere in the family of that prelate. He had a sister or a cousin who was married to someone who was Jewish, who needed help. That prelate would go to a convent or monastery and where he knew the sister, the mother superior, or he knew the man who ran the monastery, or he knew the director of a Catholic school, and he would say, please, could you take in this family? These are my relatives, these are my friends, could you do this for me? And the answer was generally yes. The courage and the daring and the willingness and the love and compassion came from men and women of the church. But those who accepted, not everyone did, of course. But I think the original request could very well have come from an individual, either Père Marie Benoit or a prelate close to Pius XII. It happened, and I think that's how it happened. The Pope, I found no indication that the Pope was involved, that the Pope gave an order, that the Pope gave support, but he knew that it was happening. He did not, well, did he stop it? That's a whole other complicated story. There was a time, a period in February of 1944, when a message from the Vatican did come out saying that those hiding in Vatican institutions, not humble convents and monasteries, but in Vatican seminaries throughout the city of Rome, that Jews hiding had to leave. This was met with horror by the Father Superior who was hiding a Jewish family, or usually in a monastery it was only men. It was met with horror that they would be ordered that the Jews should leave. Why did that order come? The order came most probably because conservatives within the Vatican hierarchy feared that hiding Jews in Vatican institutions was going to endanger the Vatican. So those Jews in hiding did have to leave. Now, they weren't thrown out. They were not thrown out. Those who were caring for them truly cared, and we have their memoirs to say how disturbed they were by the fact that they had to make their protégés leave, and how difficult it was to find another place to hide them. But they didn't abandon them, and in fact, some of them came back. So it's a very complicated story. I do, however, find that order, ordering that Jews should leave, rather inconsistent with the claims that Pius XII gave an order that Jews should be admitted. We don't have a lot of evidence here, and we even have some testimony, not much and very difficult to deal with, by nuns in particular, who claim that the Pope gave them an order to take in Jews. I've never seen evidence of that other than these 1, 2, 3, 4 testimonies, and those testimonies are often quite dubious. This takes us to the very difficult issue of Holocaust testimony in general, and how those involved don't always know the whole story. A Mother Superior might well have believed that she was doing the Pope's will by taking in a group of Jews. Or she might very well have told those sisters under her, who were terrified by taking in Jews, that yes, you've got to do this because this is the Pope's will. So it's very hard to know. And if the Pope gave an order, why did these nuns wait until 1995, 1998, when Pius XII was being criticized so much,